So trust in media is going down the drain in a sense. And we all look to media for slightly different things. I mean, for me personally, I look to media to be informed, to know what's going on, to be able to make decisions if I need that, whatever it might be. And some of us can relate to that. Others might look to media simply to have their own belief systems sort of reinforced. I don't know. But the reality of the situation is overall trust in media around the world is plummeting. And we're going to understand why that is and why that's important as to how we can move towards creating a better world. Because those things do link in some particular way, and we're going to discuss that a little bit. But first, let's set our pulse. So a new study came out in February 2021 that looks at the overall trust in media sources, any form of media source, around the world. And if you look at this graph, you kind of get a pretty good idea of what's going on here. It's almost a little bit comical in a way. Up at the top, we got Finland, Portugal, Kenya, Denmark, in and around 60% overall trust of media. And as you go down the list, the numbers continue to drop. You see the different countries, Brazil, Ireland, Germany, you go all the way down, you got Canada in there at around 45%, Croatia, Australia, and you keep going down, you get all the way to the bottom, and you see Hungary, France, United States, in and around 30% or so, and you have 29% for the United States. And you ask the question, why is the bottom of this list, the United States, at 29%? Literally, the top of the list, Finland at 65%, is more than half. Why is there so much more trust in Finland versus the United States? And that's probably a difficult, multifaceted question to answer. But at the end of the day, we see that the study itself puts forth a couple of ideas. France was placed among the lowest in the world when it came to how much consumers trusted the news media, alongside Hungary, Slovakia, and the United States. Media sources in these countries can be considered to be insufficiently independent from the establishment, whereas in France, the low trust could be attributed to recent civil dispute. So the study is essentially saying that, look, Hungary, Slovakia, and the United States, media and the establishment, they're too connected to one another. France, well, they have a lot of civil unrest going on over the past few years, so that's why. But I would argue that, in a lot of places around the world, there's probably a very strong connection. I mean, if you look at the United Kingdom, if you look at Australia, if you look at Canada, Canada is about 15% higher in trust versus the United States. And being from Canada, I have a pretty good handle on what Canadian news looks like, and I'd say that they're very much towing an establishment line. So you could probably argue that establishment connection in media is probably pretty strong throughout the vast majority of media. But why only point it out in these few countries? I'm not too sure. One other graph I want to quickly look at here is most trusted sources of general news and information worldwide. This is from 2011 to 2020, so right in kind of the beginning of the pandemic. And if we look at this, it's broken down into traditional media, search engines, owned media, and social media. So different sources of information essentially that people get. And for the most part, as general, trust goes up, you see all these things sort of going up together. And as certain things drop, you see certain things going down together. Social media has kind of always had a little bit of a tough time. But, as we push forward into 2020, you see that generally people started to have a lack of trust in all of these sources all at the same time. They're all at sort of their all-time lows. And the only time we're seeing not an all-time low is with owned media. So it seems like in 2020, owned media, so that is specifically, news sources like us. So these are websites or online properties that are owned by just individual people. They don't have any political ties. They're not owned by massive, corporations or billionaires from around the world. They're not the traditional forms of media where it's like just the TV news person sitting behind a desk talking to you from a teleprompter, right? It's a different approach. And you see that the levels of 2020 match about 2017 with owned media, whereas everything else is at an all-time low. Why is that? What's going on there? People are starting to realize en masse, especially here in the pandemic, that news and media essentially focuses deeply on either entertaining people or just moving along with establishment narratives. Those who fund and own the media are going to provide and make sure narratives are pushed forth that align with those overall agendas or goals. Now, a lot of people say like, whoa, that can't be happening. That sounds a little bit like a conspiracy. That can't be real. Look at the reality of the situation. If mainstream media, which I think they get, if you look at overall TV spending from pharma, it's something like $4.58 billion in 2020. that was given to these TV stations. And you got to think, each one of these TV stations has a news source, whether it be ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox, whatever it might be, as their primary news for that station. Now, would it not be very disadvantageous for them to be taking pharmaceutical money over here to fund the station, but then at the same time, be basically talking down these pharmaceutical companies with bad press on their news stations? Of course they're not going to do that, because they would lose their funding. So in essence, there's a direct conflict of interest between the news stories you're going to see from those particular corporate news outlets when it comes to pharmaceutical stories, just as an example. This is just as one example as when we're talking about big pharma. And we saw that throughout the pandemic, very inexpensive and effective drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin were pretty much erased from mainstream media coverage. And not only that, they were put down. There was a lot of sort of false narratives pushed about them and their danger and how they could hurt people and they're unproven and they don't work. When in reality, all the studies showed that they did work, and doctors were standing up, waving their flag, like, come interview me, like, let me talk about these particular, healing modalities, because they're gonna help save a lot of COVID lives, a lot of lives from COVID. But no, they were shut out. All while these sources pushed the expensive vaccines that these pharmaceutical companies who fund the stations obviously are making. So you have the direct conflict of interest. People were not being told the truth about what was happening with the pandemic when it comes specifically to treatment and when it comes to the solution that came along, which was the vaccine, because it's a direct conflict of interest. So you got to ask the question, are people really informed by watching this form of media? And obviously the answer to that is no. And then on the flip side, you start thinking, well, why is there a distrust in media? Well, as owned media continues to grow in popularity and more people are watching this and conversations start to change and people start going, well, have you heard about ivermectin? Have you heard about hydroxychloroquine? And everyone's going, no, I haven't heard about that. What do you mean? What's going on? Well, a portion of those people who then go and look at ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, and it's coming from the owned media section, are going to start to say, why didn't I hear about this on the news? Why didn't I don't know what's going on here. And then boom, the trust starts to drop, right? At the same time with COVID, we just saw that nobody knew what was going on for the most part anywhere. Everybody was pretty confused, and that's okay. It's a pandemic. A lot of things were happening quickly. A lot of things were evolving quickly. But once we got a handle on, after the first few months, kind of what was happening, we started to see the establishment media go in one direction. That was just pure fear, pure panic, pure authoritarian rule. Everything was guided towards these elite sort of obsessive authoritarian ideas, where on the flip side, owned media was kind of projecting this, hey guys, this isn't that bad. This is actually more inspiring. We shouldn't be so panicked about this. We should make sure that we maintain community. We should make sure that we maintain connection. Perhaps there's a different agenda going on here that we need to kind of talk about. And that created obviously a bit of a rift where more and more people started to realize, well, establishment media is saying one thing and owned media or independent media is saying something different, and that's creating a pretty big divide. So you got to start to ask the question, what's going on there? I mean, obviously we see the establishment connection, but we also see a very big level of bias. And we don't just see that big level of bias from a corporate sort of establishment narrative sort of push, but we also see it from a political level. We also see that in mainstream media, there's always this left-right approach, right? Trying to get people locked up in this divisive sort of political spectrum. We do see that a lot in independent media as well, but in particular with independent media, it feels like sometimes it's a little bit less because it's generally a little bit more honest. It's covering more stories that are, not as divisive, not trying to keep people not only in the left-right, but also the establishment left-right, right? So it's like an extra form of sort of limitation and manipulation that's happening on the mainstream media side versus the independent side. But interestingly, as we look at another poll here that came out of Gallup, although 57% of US adults see at least a fair amount of bias in their go-to news source, they are much more concerned about bias in the news other people are getting than about the bias in their own news. So the interesting part of this is you have 34% of people who are saying, yeah, the bias in my own news, no big deal. I'm going to see through that. It's not a huge issue. It's not really going to affect me. Whereas 64% of people are saying, I'm worried about the people over there. I don't think they're going to see through the bias. I don't think they're going to get it. I think that they're going to get caught up in the whole idea of whatever extreme narrative is being passed on to them by, some news source that they're looking into. That's a problem. I don't trust them. And I think that's interesting because it kind of suggests this huge loss of connection in our society, right? When we look at what's happening in our current events, I mean, we have to ask the question, what does that mean about who we are and how we're operating and what our state of being is? And when we see that as time goes on, we have this increasing loss of connection. We're not coming together as people. We're not understanding each other as much. We're not, getting really in touch with and empathizing with why people feel what they feel, why they believe what they believe. We're instead being told through media, specifically, again, establishment media, what to think about the other side, right? So we're hearing all the time, like, you have these crazy Republicans, or you have these, these Democrats who've lost their mind, and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. Perhaps in the COVID narrative, you have the people that are all the good people who are getting their vaccines, and then you have these crazy, unhinged conspiracy anti-vaxxers who are going to kill everybody, right? And they paint this picture of what these people are like, and if you don't actually connect with people, you never really get to understand what's going on there with those people. And that loss of connection is evident with what's going on right now, and probably why people feel like they're worried that other people are getting their news from a biased source, right? And I remember having a conversation with Charles Eisenstein, I think it was late in 2020, and we were talking about the idea. He had a person in his community who had volunteered for in one of Andrew Yang's presidential campaigns, to go around and go door to door in a Republican neighborhood and talk about policies and this, that, whatever, see if they could get the vote for Yang. And there was a group of these volunteers that were going to do this, and they obviously went into the day thinking, well, we're going to be talking to these Republicans, and it's going to kind of be like, oh, they're all going to be weird and have these crazy beliefs, and they're going to be really intense, and they're all going to have very, very specific beliefs around the issues we're going to talk to them about. But when they actually knocked on the doors and entered the homes and connected with people, they all started to realize, wow, these were totally not the people I thought they were going to be. Like, they're very much more like me than I thought, right? There's a much deeper sense of connection there. And I think this is one of the important pieces, and again, why the trust is being lost, is people are starting to figure out on their own that the story that's being made up about other people in society and how they are and how they think and how they should be is really just geared towards keeping you as a viewer and keeping you from connecting with other people. When in reality, when we're going out and we're connecting with those people, we're starting to go, wait a minute, the media's lying to us. They're just dividing us. There's a great level of division. So why should we trust them if there's always this intense attack happening? Now, of course, not everybody gets this. Not everybody is seeing this part of what's going on. Some people are just, taking it in and believing what they believe and so on and so forth. But it is increasing. So we're seeing a greater and greater loss of trust. And this sort of leads to one final graph I want to look at. I covered this graph back when they had updated it up to 2018, and now it's been updated to 2020. And what you see here is, a big increase in the divide, right, between the left and the right when it comes to trust in media in the United States. Now you can see where that divide sort of began, which was in 2016. That's when the vast majority of the media in the United States became purely democratically focused, just attacking Trump 24/7 all day long, whether it was true or not true. They just made shit up, right? We all know that at this point. So you see a massive decline there in Republicans trusting, the mainstream media, because they're like, well, obviously they're lying, right? And so a lot of those Republicans went to independent media, and because the mainstream media was just towing the Democratic line, pushing Trump hate 24/7. We basically saw that they trusted media at an all-time high. And still today, here in the pandemic, because it has been politicized so deeply, and it's been politicized specifically through conservatives and through Democrats as well, you still see a remaining divide where a lot of conservatives have moved to the more independent media sector, whereas Democrats still have a high level of sort of trust in the mainstream media. What are we seeing here? What's the takeaway? What do we move from this? We are living in different realities right now. What do I mean by that? I'm not talking about, hey, you have a small difference in opinion here and there, or whatever it might be. based on the media and sources that we're choosing and how different they are, whether it's independent media that doesn't align with any political side, whether it's independent media that's fully entrenched in different political sides, or whether it's mainstream media that's just obsessed with pushing authoritative sort of consensus narratives that come from the establishment, we're all going to be living in completely different realities. It's not about having different opinions. We live in different realities. We think that what is going on in the world is different. And because of that, we can literally not relate to each other and make effective decisions. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges that exists right now, is that we're living in a time where we need to come together, we need to connect, and we need to make important decisions that move us towards creating a reality where we can truly thrive. But we can't do that if all of the perspectives that we're getting are literally representing different realities that make no sense. Some people believe 100% that COVID is the most dangerous thing in the world because that's all they've been told. Whereas other people have a completely different perspective that says, well, I don't know, maybe the virus isn't really that dangerous. Maybe the vaccine isn't really that safe, right? The point is these people aren't going to be able to relate to each other in any way, shape, or form because they're not consuming the same media. So how are we supposed to make decisions together? We can't. So this is a very important discussion. This is a very important detail that we got to figure out. The reality of the situation is when we're choosing media sources, we want to be choosing media sources that are inspiring us, right? Like if we want to know what's going on in the world, and if we want to be educated, and we want to be able to make decisions that are based on reality, right? It means that we need to go to media sources that aren't politically funded or politically oriented, either left or right, and just going to be pushing that narrative over and over and over again because you're only going to hear limited perspectives. Not only that, but you don't want to go to media sources that are very establishment driven. Most of mainstream media is funded and is pushing these establishment narratives because that's where they get their money from, or the people who own these outlets very much want their controlling narratives to move forward. And we see that a lot with the Great Reset. If you want to dive in deeply, start looking into Vanguard, a company called Vanguard, and a company called BlackRock. And you'll see that they own the vast majority of powerful companies in the United States, but they also own the vast majority of the media. Now, they don't own them entirely, but they own good chunks of them, right? So basically, these corporate entities that own everything are pushing their narratives through the media outlets that they own. And that makes up a good chunk of all the media that people are hearing when it comes to a mainstream level. So if we want to be inspired, we need to look at media that is telling us, hey, here's a new vision for society, or here's a way you can think about what type of society you want to live in, right? Really push you to question instead of just hearing the same, this is how the world works, this is how the world needs to function, this is what's going on over and over and over again. You need to fight the Democrats, you need to fight the Republicans, you need to fight these people, you need to fight that. What about media that challenges you to say, hey, what can we actually do? What do you want your world to look like? Instead of me telling you what it should look like, what happens if we just explore different ideas? And we always bring it back to empowering ourselves, empowering each other to say, what do we actually want to create? If we bring it upon ourselves to be engaged, what do we want to see? What do we want to create? How can we embody that? Can I watch a news source that is consistently reminding me to embody that, to have that perspective, versus here's what's going on, just keep playing into the same reality that we have over and over and over again. Don't think outside the little box, because if we do that, then it's danger. We don't want to do that, right? If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, liking, hitting the notification bell so that you continue getting our content. We also have another channel called Collective Evolution where we talk about a lot of the more personal transformation, a lot of the tips, the tricks, the ways that we can find greater peace within ourselves. We can prepare ourselves for the chaotic world that we're experiencing right now, where obviously a lot is changing, a lot is going on, and we have to both be able to consume information and know how to make decisions, but also stay well regulated within ourselves, know how to move through daily life without getting all caught up in the emotions and the challenges and the chaos of what's going on. So it's important to do both sides of this work. So if you want to follow us there, there'll be a link in the description for Collective Evolution as well. Thanks so much for watching this video and consider sharing it out.